The first sound wasn't the judge's voice, it was laughter. My husband laughed first, sharp and confident, the kind of laugh meant to be heard. His mistress followed immediately, a high, careless giggle that bounced off the courtroom walls, as if this were some private joke they were letting the rest of us in on. A few people near them smiled. Someone behind me let out a soft chuckle. The sound spread, uneven and uncomfortable, but it spread all the same. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, staring straight ahead as if I hadn't just become the punchline of my own life. I could feel the heat in my face, the awareness of being watched from every angle, being laughed at in private hurts. Being laughed at in public strips something out of you. It tells you exactly where you stand. My husband leaned toward her and whispered something I couldn't hear. Whatever it was, it sent her into another fit of laughter. She covered her mouth with her hand, eyes shining, as if she were trying and failing to be polite. He smiled, satisfied, already certain of the ending. The room felt loose, out of control, like everyone had decided the story was over before it was even told. Then I noticed the judge. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't moved. He was looking down at the papers in front of him, reading, listening, letting the noise exist just a moment longer than it should have. One by one, the laughter thinned. The whispers died. Chairs creaked as people straightened in their seats. The judge looked up. That was the exact second everything changed. The courtroom fell silent so fast it felt like pressure in my ears. My husband's smile stiffened, not disappearing, just freezing in place. His mistress shifted in her chair, suddenly aware of her hands, her posture, her breathing. No one laughed anymore, not because they understood what was coming, but because something in the air had warned them to stop. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I didn't look at my husband or the woman sitting beside him. I kept my eyes forward, calm enough to make anyone watching assume I was defeated. That was the mistake they'd been making for a long time. The judge cleared his throat, and even that small sound carried weight. He didn't scold. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the room the way someone does when they're about to remind everyone who's actually in charge. In that moment, as everyone waited for him to speak, I understood something clearly. This wasn't the first time I'd been underestimated. It was just the loudest. People love to believe they can tell who's losing at a glance. They read posture, silence, stillness, and mistake restraint for weakness. Sitting there, surrounded by smirks and confidence that wasn't earned, I let them believe whatever made them comfortable. They thought I had nothing left, no leverage, no ground to stand on. They thought I'd already lost. The judge glanced back down at his papers, and the pause stretched just long enough to make my husband shift in his seat. I could feel his attention flick toward me, checking for a reaction, a crack, anything that would confirm what he believed. I gave him nothing. This wasn't the final hearing. Anyone who understood the process knew that. But moments like this had a way of setting the tone, of deciding who entered the room as a person to be heard and who entered as an afterthought. My husband believed he'd already secured his place. He believed this was all procedural now. I let him believe that too. As the judge prepared to continue, my mind drifted, not away from the room, but back through the quiet chain of decisions that had led us here. None of this had happened suddenly. The laughter didn't come out of nowhere. It was practiced, earned in its own way. I'd been taught to be calm, to listen more than I spoke, to smooth things over instead of making scenes. Those habits had once been praised. They'd called me easy, reasonable, supportive. Over time, those words changed meaning. They became permissions. Looking around the courtroom, I could see how the story had been written without me, the confident husband, the new woman by his side, the wife who stayed too quiet for too long. It was a neat narrative, one that made people comfortable enough to laugh. The judge finally began to speak, and the sound of his voice pulled everyone back into their seats. My husband sat straighter, adjusting his jacket, ready to play his part. His mistress folded her hands, eyes forward now, polite and composed, as if she hadn't been laughing seconds earlier. I breathed in slowly, steadying myself, not because I was afraid, but because I knew what came next would require patience. They thought I was here to defend myself. They didn't know I was here to let the truth do the talking. Before that day in court, before the laughter and the silence that followed it, there had been a long list of moments where they learned to underestimate me. And without realizing it, I had helped them do exactly that. The judge hadn't spoken yet, but the room had already changed. Everyone was waiting, balanced on that thin edge between certainty and doubt. I stayed seated, hands still folded, my face neutral enough to invite misinterpretation. People assumed silence meant surrender. They always had. What none of them knew was that this moment in the courtroom was only the end of a long pattern, not the beginning of it. The laughter didn't come from nowhere. It was built, piece by piece, over years of learning exactly how small they believed I was. It started long before the courtroom, long before the whispers and the smirks. I met my husband in a different city, years earlier, when my life was orderly and fully my own. I was in my late 20s then, settled into a career I'd built carefully, proud of the independence that came with paying my own bills and making my own decisions. I wasn't looking to be rescued. I wasn't waiting for anyone to complete me. That was part of why he noticed me. He liked that I didn't need him. He liked that I was capable, that I spoke clearly, that I didn't fill silence just to make people comfortable. In the beginning, he told me he admired my judgment. He said I was thoughtful, grounded, the kind of woman who didn't overreact. I believed him. I took it as respect. Our early relationship felt balanced. We made decisions together. We argued occasionally, but never cruelly. When we disagreed, we talked it through, or so I thought. I wasn't chasing him, and he wasn't chasing me. We met in the middle, and that felt like partnership. Looking back, I can see the first shift clearly, but at the time it was almost invisible. He liked how calmly I handled things. When something went wrong, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand explanations. I listened. He praised that part of me often, telling friends and family how easy I was to be with, how reasonable, how I didn't make drama out of nothing. I didn't realize I was being given a role. When I met his family, I tried to be respectful without trying too hard. They were polite, warm on the surface, curious in the way people are when they're deciding where you fit. His mother smiled a lot, asked questions about my work, nodded approvingly when I spoke. His relatives described me as supportive, low maintenance, not demanding. At the time, those words felt like compliments. I didn't hear what was underneath them yet. I didn't understand that being described that way meant expectations were already forming. I was being placed carefully into a category that would later be used against me. The first time I made myself smaller, it didn't feel like sacrifice, it felt like maturity. We disagreed over something minor, a practical decision that mattered more to me than it did to him. I remember explaining my reasoning calmly, laying out the facts the way I always did. He listened, then countered with a softer argument that leaned more on convenience than logic. In the end, I let it go. Not because I thought he was right, but because I believed the relationship mattered more than winning. He seemed relieved, not grateful. At the time, I thought nothing of it. What I didn't know was that moment taught him something important about me. It taught him that if he waited long enough, I would step aside to keep the peace. I didn't know I was teaching a lesson I'd one day regret. I told myself that compromise was strength, that stability mattered more than control. I believed that choosing calm over conflict made me wise. Others saw it differently. They saw compliance where I saw restraint. They mistook patience for passivity, and I never corrected them. That misunderstanding followed me into the marriage. Over time, decisions shifted subtly. I was still consulted, but less often. My input was acknowledged, then quietly overridden. When I noticed, I questioned myself before questioning him. I didn't want to be the person who saw problems where there were none. His family mirrored his language. They praised my flexibility, my understanding, my ability to adapt. They never asked what I wanted. They assumed they already knew. I didn't feel erased then. Not yet. I felt trusted to handle things quietly, to absorb tension so others wouldn't have to. I believed that was my role, and for a while, I wore it willingly. What I didn't realize was that every time I stayed silent to keep things smooth, I made it easier for people to speak for me. Every time I backed down without protest, I reinforced the idea that my position was optional. By the time the balance shifted noticeably, the pattern was already set. In the courtroom, waiting for the judge to continue, I could almost see that version of myself sitting beside me, the woman who believed being calm would protect her. She didn't know yet how often calmness is used as an invitation. The people around me had learned to underestimate me because I had allowed them to, not out of weakness, but out of faith in a system that rewarded fairness. They assumed I wouldn't fight, wouldn't notice, wouldn't act. By the time they realized how wrong that assumption was, it would already be far too late. The marriage didn't crack all at once. It shifted. At first, it was small enough to dismiss. Conversations grew shorter, not colder, just trimmed of their warmth. He answered questions with efficiency instead of curiosity. Eye contact became optional. I told myself this was what long-term commitment looked like once the novelty wore off. There was no single moment I could point to and say, "This is where it started." That uncertainty made it easier to doubt myself. Nothing was wrong enough to confront, and everything was wrong enough to feel it in my body. His schedule changed before his attitude did. He started coming home later, offering explanations that were vague but plausible. Meetings ran long. Dinners with colleagues appeared on nights that used to belong to us. When I asked follow-up questions, his answers were smooth, almost rehearsed, like he'd anticipated the curiosity and prepared for it. I adjusted. I always did. I stopped asking when he'd be home and started planning my evenings without him. I told myself independence was healthy, that space was good, that love didn't need constant checking in. On the surface, it looked like maturity. Underneath, it was adaptation. The tone changed next. He grew defensive over things that had never mattered before. Questions became accusations in his mind. Clarifications turned into challenges. At the same time, he developed an impressive calm in situations that should have carried weight. Decisions that affected both of us were treated as minor details. My reactions were labeled intense, my concerns unnecessary. "You're overthinking," he'd say lightly, as if he were doing me a favor. Those words lodged somewhere deep, not because they were cruel, but because they were dismissive. He wasn't angry, he was unconcerned. That indifference was harder to argue with. I began paying attention to patterns instead of explanations, times he avoided certain topics, the way his phone never left his side, the careful neutrality in his voice when I mentioned future plans. None of it proved anything on its own, but together they formed a picture that refused to blur. Still, I didn't confront him. Part of me wanted to believe that naming the problem would fix it. Another part knew better. Confrontation would give him information, and I wasn't ready to reveal how much I was seeing. So I listened more than I spoke. I remembered more than I reacted. The change wasn't limited to our home. His family's energy shifted too, subtle but unmistakable. Conversations that once felt open became curated. Advice came wrapped in concern but carried judgment underneath. They echoed his language without realizing it, using the same phrases, the same framing, as if they'd been rehearsing together. "She means well," his mother said once, in a tone that suggested I didn't. "She just worries too much." It wasn't said unkindly, that made it worse. I realized then that conversations were happening without me. Decisions were being discussed, opinions formed, narratives shaped. I was no longer part of the inner circle of my own marriage. I was an observer, allowed close enough to watch but not to influence. The moment I stopped feeling safe wasn't dramatic. It was a small thing. A document I hadn't seen before, a decision that had already been made when it was presented to me. A casual comment about plans I wasn't included in. Nothing that would have raised alarms on its own, but together they formed a conclusion I couldn't ignore. I wasn't being consulted, I was being informed. That realization was cold, sharp, and immediate. It cut through the fog of rationalization I'd been living in. This wasn't about stress or distance or miscommunication. It was about control. Two voices argued in my head after that. One wanted peace, wanted to believe this could still be talked through. The other recognized the shape of a threat. The second voice was quieter, but it was steadier. I chose to listen to it. I stopped filling silences. I stopped volunteering opinions that weren't asked for. I let conversations end where they wanted to end. From the outside, it probably looked like withdrawal. From the inside, it was focus. The line was crossed publicly, not privately. We were with people when it happened, in a setting where politeness usually protected appearances. He interrupted me mid-sentence, dismissed what I was saying with a smile, and redirected the conversation without hesitation. No one challenged him. No one looked uncomfortable. They followed his lead as if it were natural. I stopped speaking. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was accepted. That was what told me everything I needed to know. The room had already decided whose voice mattered. I didn't argue. I didn't correct him. I didn't defend myself. I watched as the conversation moved on without me, as if I had simply stepped out of frame. That was the first time I understood this wasn't just happening to me. It was being done to me. And once I saw that clearly, there was no unseeing it. I knew something was wrong the moment I walked into the room. It was a formal gathering, the kind where everyone dressed carefully and spoke softly, where appearances mattered more than honesty. I had arrived on time, composed, dressed appropriately, expecting nothing more than basic courtesy. Instead, I felt it immediately, the pause, the shift, the way conversations dipped when I got close. People smiled, but the smiles didn't reach their eyes. Chairs were rearranged in small, deliberate ways. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, waiting for someone to acknowledge me, to gesture toward a seat, to explain what I was missing. No one did. I followed the room with my eyes and saw it clearly then. The place where I was meant to sit was gone. Not occupied, removed. A different arrangement had been made, one that didn't account for me at all. At first, I wondered if it was a mistake, an oversight, something logistical that could be corrected with a quick word. But the longer I stood there, the more obvious it became. This hadn't been forgotten. It had been decided. I took a seat where I could, quietly, aware of the heat creeping up my neck. My heart wasn't racing, my hands didn't shake. What I felt was something steadier and far more dangerous, a deep, unsettling clarity. Then I saw her. She entered as if she belonged there, as if the space had been prepared for her arrival. She didn't hesitate or search the room. She knew exactly where she was going. People greeted her naturally, warmly, with the kind of ease that comes from familiarity. No one looked surprised. She smiled, comfortable, confident, her presence accepted without question. When she reached my husband, she didn't pause. She stood beside him as if that position had always been hers. That was when the truth settled in. This wasn't gossip or suspicion anymore. This was an announcement. I looked at my husband, waiting for something. An explanation, a correction, a moment of decency. Our eyes met briefly. His expression didn't change. He didn't introduce her. He didn't clarify anything. He simply placed his hand at the small of her back and guided her forward. It was a small gesture. It said everything. That was his choice. Around us, the room adjusted smoothly, almost gracefully. Conversations continued. Drinks were passed. Someone laughed at the wrong moment, then recovered quickly. People avoided my eyes, not out of shame, but out of self-preservation. No one wanted to be involved. Silence was safer. I understood then how erasure worked. It wasn't loud. It didn't require cruelty. It relied on enough people deciding not to interrupt. The humiliation wasn't sharp. It was dull and spreading, like pressure. I felt myself becoming invisible in real time, my presence reduced to an inconvenience everyone politely ignored. I stayed. I didn't make a scene. I didn't demand answers or draw attention to myself. I watched. I listened. I noted who spoke freely and who looked away. I memorized the expressions on their faces, the way the story was already being told without me. When I finally stood to leave, I did it quietly. No one stopped me. No one asked if I was all right. That absence of resistance told me more than any confrontation could have. Outside, the air felt colder than it should have. I walked to my car slowly, each step measured, my body moving on instinct while my mind replayed everything I'd just seen. There was no confusion left to work through. No questions waiting for answers. This hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been impulsive. It had been planned. Later, alone, the shock wore off and something else took its place. Not anger, not grief, recognition. They weren't trying to hurt me. They were trying to remove me. Once I named that truth, everything else lined up. The quiet decisions made without me, the shifting language, the way my role had been reduced over time. This event wasn't the betrayal. It was the confirmation. There was a photograph from that night that surfaced later. Someone had taken it without thinking. In it, my husband stood smiling, his arm around her, surrounded by people who looked relaxed and certain. I wasn't in the frame. Not because I'd stepped away, but because the picture had been composed without me in mind. That image stayed with me. It wasn't the sight of them together that changed me. It was the realization that they believed the transition was complete, that I had already been written out. That night, sitting alone in a quiet house that no longer felt like home, I made a decision I didn't announce to anyone. I didn't cry or call a friend or draft messages I wouldn't send. I simply acknowledged the line that had been crossed. I would never beg to be included again. From that moment on, I understood the nature of what I was facing. This wasn't about love lost or pride wounded. It was about control and erasure, about deciding who counted and who didn't. And once someone tries to erase you, there's no going back to pretending things are fine. That night, I stopped hoping for fairness. I started preparing for something else entirely. The house was quiet when I came back that night, but it wasn't peaceful. It felt rearranged in ways I couldn't name at first. Nothing was missing. Nothing was obviously out of place. And yet the air had shifted, as if someone had been there earlier, deciding what still belonged and what no longer did. I set my bag down and stood in the entryway longer than necessary, listening. There were no footsteps, no voices, no explanations waiting for me. Whatever had changed had already happened. I didn't cry. I didn't sit on the floor or reach for my phone. I walked through the room slowly, noticing details I'd stopped noticing years ago. The desk where I'd once worked late nights. The shelf where shared plans had turned into assumptions. Everything looked the same, but it didn't feel like it was mine anymore. That was when the first thought surfaced, quiet and unsettling. They weren't just moving on, they were moving me out. The realization didn't come with panic, it came with focus. Later, when I tried to log into an account I'd accessed countless times before, the screen refreshed and asked for credentials I didn't recognize. I tried again, slower this time, careful not to assume a mistake. The same message appeared. Access denied. At first, I thought it was technical, a system update, a forgotten password. I made a note to check it in the morning, but the note stayed in my head, heavy and persistent, refusing to be filed away. I checked something else, then another. Each time there was a small friction where there hadn't been any before. A delay, a missing option, a subtle change in language that suggested a shift in authority. Nothing dramatic enough to justify alarm on its own, but together, it formed a pattern that made my chest tighten. I hadn't lost him that night. I'd lost something else entirely. The next day, I started paying attention in a different way. Not emotionally, but methodically. I looked at documents I'd trusted without question, agreements I'd skimmed because I believed the intent behind them was shared, dates that suddenly mattered more than they had before. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask what had changed. I didn't let my tone betray curiosity or concern. I treated the situation the way I treated work problems, by gathering information before speaking. What I found wasn't obvious, it was careful. Language had shifted over time. Titles had been adjusted, roles clarified in ways that favored him without openly excluding me. Decisions had been framed as efficiency, as simplification, as progress. At no point had anyone said I didn't belong. They'd simply stopped writing me into the picture. I remembered conversations I'd brushed off, moments when he'd said, "I'll handle it," and I'd agreed because it felt easier. Times when I'd signed something without insisting on a longer discussion. Each instance seemed insignificant at the time. Together they told a different story. This hadn't been done overnight. It had been planned slowly, patiently, with the confidence of someone who believed the other person wouldn't notice until it was too late. I began to understand the true nature of the affair. It wasn't the betrayal itself. It was a distraction. While my attention had been focused on emotional distance and shifting loyalty, something else had been happening quietly in the background. I had been repositioned. In conversations with his family, I was referred to as support, as someone who helped, not as someone who built or decided or owned. They spoke about what he was doing and his plans with an ease that suggested my role had already been revised. No one corrected them, least of all him. He moved with a confidence that made sense now. This wasn't arrogance, it was certainty. He behaved like someone who believed the outcomes were already settled, like someone who had contingency plans in place. I felt exposed in a way I hadn't before, not emotionally but structurally. The protections I'd assumed were mutual were not. He was operating with cover. I was standing in open air, still playing by rules he'd quietly stepped away from. For a moment I considered confronting him, demanding clarity, forcing a conversation that would either fix everything or tear it apart. The urge was strong, immediate, tempting. I dismissed it just as quickly. Confrontation would give him information. It would tell him what I knew, what I suspected, where I was looking, and I couldn't afford that, not yet. Instead, I did something that felt unnatural but necessary. I waited. I stopped assuming good faith. I stopped filling in gaps with trust. I documented what I saw, not obsessively, but consistently. Dates, language, small inconsistencies that repeated themselves too often to be coincidence. I didn't need certainty yet. I needed consistency. That was the moment I stopped waiting for fairness. Fairness depended on shared values, and I was no longer sure those existed here. What I needed now was clarity, and clarity came from patience. It became clear that this wasn't about love lost or pride wounded. It wasn't even about replacing me with someone else. This was about erasing my claim to what we'd built together. About rewriting history so that my contributions became invisible. That understanding settled something in me. Fear didn't disappear, but it sharpened into resolve. I wasn't angry, I wasn't vengeful, I was awake. They believed I was still reacting, still hurt, still trying to process. In reality, I had already moved into a different phase. That was the moment I understood what was truly at stake. They weren't trying to leave me behind. They were trying to make it look like I'd never been there at all. And once I saw that clearly, I knew exactly what I couldn't afford to do. I couldn't warn them. I couldn't rush. And I couldn't let them know that the story they were writing was about to be read very differently. I learned how to live between two realities. On the surface, nothing changed. I still moved through the house the same way, still asked the same polite questions, still answered messages with the same even tone. Anyone watching would have said I was adjusting, settling into the inevitable. That assumption protected me more than they realized. Inside, everything had sharpened. I noticed the timing of his footsteps, the pauses before his answers, the way he avoided specifics while sounding reassuring. Conversations felt staged, like scenes repeated until they no longer required attention. I played my part carefully, responding just enough to appear present without revealing what I was paying attention to. He believed I was retreating. That belief made him careless. The moment I stopped hoping came quietly. There was no argument, no dramatic exchange, just a brief, dismissive interaction, the kind that would have passed unnoticed months earlier. I mentioned something that mattered to me. He waved it off without looking up, already focused elsewhere. That was it. Not because it hurt, but because it clarified. There would be no explanation worth waiting for, no apology offered freely. Whatever remained between us was no longer a partnership. It was a structure he was rearranging to suit himself. I let the hope dissolve without mourning it. That same night, I set a rule for myself. I didn't write it down or say it aloud. I simply decided. I would not react emotionally in front of them. I would not ask questions that revealed what I knew. I would not seek validation from people who had already chosen their side. Silence, I realized, was not surrender. It was a way to keep my options open. From that point on, I spoke less and listened more. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped trying to be understood. Every word I didn't say became space to observe. There was a moment, brief but steady, when something I'd learned years ago resurfaced. Not a childhood memory or a warning passed down, but a lesson earned the hard way. Power rarely announces itself. It waits. It gathers. It belongs to the person who can resist the urge to move first. I returned to the present with that thought settled firmly in place. I began to disappear in plain sight. I stopped offering opinions unless asked directly. I agreed to changes without debate. I accepted partial explanations and nodded as if they satisfied me. The relief was immediate. I could see it in their posture, in the way tension left their shoulders. They stopped watching me. That was the advantage. When people believe you're done, they become generous with their mistakes. They speak more freely. They correct themselves less. They assume the story is already finished. I started documenting quietly. Not obsessively, not emotionally. I kept track of dates, statements, small shifts that repeated too often to be coincidence. I didn't try to connect everything at once. I let patterns form on their own. The hardest part was resisting the urge to confront him when something new surfaced. Each discovery came with a flash of anger, a moment where I wanted to demand answers, to force honesty into the open. I let those moments pass. Confrontation would have given him information. It would have told him where to reinforce, where to hide, where to adjust. I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I focused on consistency. I didn't need him to confess. I needed him to continue behaving the way he had been. Predictability was more valuable than truth at this stage. There were moments of doubt. Quiet ones late at night, when the house was still, and the weight of what I was doing pressed in on me. I understood what this path required. Once I moved fully into it, there would be no going back to how things were, no return to ignorance or assumption. I accepted that cost. I wasn't fighting to save the marriage anymore. I was fighting to preserve myself, my agency, my right to exist fully in a story that was being rewritten without my consent. That shift changed everything. I no longer measured my days by how he treated me. I measured them by how much I learned, by how clearly I could see the shape of what was unfolding. Each piece of information steadied me, replacing fear with understanding. By the time he noticed how quiet I'd become, he interpreted it as resignation. He mistook my restraint for defeat. His confidence grew, and with it, his carelessness. That was when I knew the decision I'd made was irreversible. I wasn't improvising anymore. I wasn't reacting. I had crossed into something deliberate and controlled, something that required patience and discipline. That night, lying awake in the dark, I didn't make a plan. Plans could change. Plans could be disrupted. What I made instead was a promise to myself. I would not reveal my awareness too soon. I would not be rushed by emotion or provocation. I would let them believe exactly what made them most comfortable. And I would see this through no matter how long it took. Once that promise was made, I never broke it. I learned how to move without making noise. From the outside, my life looked unchanged. I kept the same routines, asked the same neutral questions, showed up where I was expected. If anyone had been asked, they would have said I was coping, maybe even accepting what was happening. That perception was useful. It allowed me to exist in the background, unnoticed and unchallenged. Inside, everything had narrowed to focus. I stopped reacting to what I felt and started paying attention to what mattered. Every conversation became information. Every casual comment carried weight. I didn't interrupt or clarify when something sounded off. I let people keep talking. Silence encouraged honesty far more than confrontation ever had. The first ally appeared quietly without drama or promises. It wasn't someone swooping in to rescue me. It was a professional interaction that began as a simple request for clarification. I framed it that way on purpose. I asked careful questions, stuck to facts, avoided emotional language. I didn't share my suspicions or my story. I shared details. The person across from me listened longer than necessary. When I finished, they paused, flipped a page, and frowned slightly. "That's not how this usually works," they said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't reassurance. It was something better. It was confirmation that what I was seeing wasn't imagined. I didn't react. I didn't push. I thanked them and left with less than I wanted but more than I needed. From that moment on, I understood the difference between help and collaboration. I didn't need someone to fight for me. I needed someone who could recognize a pattern when it was placed in front of them. That shifted my approach. I stopped trying to understand intent. Intent was slippery, easy to deny, impossible to prove. Actions, on the other hand, were solid. They left traces. They created records. I let my husband continue believing I wanted peace. I let his family believe I was stepping back gracefully. I accepted partial explanations and nodded as if they were complete. Every assumption they made about me created another opening. The trap wasn't built all at once. It took shape slowly, layer by layer. I understood their expectations clearly now. They thought I wanted closure. They believed I was tired. They assumed I would choose comfort over resistance. That belief guided every move they made. I used it. I asked questions that sounded harmless. I agreed to changes that seemed minor. I thanked people for information they didn't realize they were giving me. The more cooperative I appeared, the less guarded they became. Their carelessness grew with their confidence. He started speaking more freely around me, dropping details he once would have hidden. Conversations no longer stopped when I entered the room. Jokes were made, plans discussed openly, assumptions spoken aloud as if they were facts. I listened. I didn't correct contradictions when they appeared. I didn't point out inconsistencies. I noted them and waited for the next one. Patterns don't reveal themselves through force. They reveal themselves through repetition. There were moments when the weight of it all pressed in, moments when staying silent felt like swallowing something sharp. Each time I reminded myself of the alternative. Speaking too soon would collapse everything. It would alert them, give them time to adjust, to erase what they could still reach. Patience wasn't passive, it was precise. I collected without confronting. Dates that didn't align. Statements that contradicted earlier ones. Small decisions that favored one narrative over another. Each detail alone meant nothing. Together they told a story no one could easily deny. They didn't notice the shift. Why would they? To them, I was already finished, already written out, already quiet enough to ignore. That belief locked the door behind them. One evening, as they talked openly about what came next, I realized I could see the entire pattern clearly for the first time. Not fragments or suspicions, but a full outline. Every move made sense in context. Every decision fit. I felt calm, focused, unafraid. They were still talking, still laughing lightly, still planning as if the outcome was guaranteed. I watched them from across the room, not with anger, but with a strange sense of distance. They had no idea how exposed they were. By the time they noticed anything was wrong, every door behind them would already be closed. They had mistaken my silence for surrender, my cooperation for compliance. They believed I was standing still, when in reality, I had already moved past the point where turning back was possible. I wasn't waiting anymore. The trap was active, and I was the only one who knew exactly how it would end. They grew comfortable in ways they shouldn't have. It wasn't dramatic at first. Just small shifts in how they spoke around me, how freely they moved through conversations that once would have paused when I entered the room. They stopped lowering their voices. They stopped checking who was listening. Confidence had made them sloppy. I noticed it immediately. He began assuming I wouldn't question anything anymore. Instructions were given instead of explanations. Decisions were mentioned casually, like facts that no longer required agreement. When I nodded, when I accepted things without comment, it confirmed what he already believed. That I was done. The first privilege they took for granted was access. Not mine, theirs. They assumed certain doors were closed to me simply because I hadn't knocked on them lately. They spoke openly about timelines, about next steps, about things they believed were already settled. One afternoon he handed me a document without thinking. It was routine, unimportant in his mind, just something he needed scanned and sent along. He didn't watch me as I took it. He didn't hesitate or explain. They handed me something they never should have. I didn't react. I didn't slow down or ask questions. I scanned it the same way I always did, casually, almost lazily. Inside, something clicked into place. A name appeared where it shouldn't have. A date sat uncomfortably close to another I already knew. The language didn't match the story I'd been told. It wasn't a mistake. It was the mistake. I didn't rush to confirm it. I didn't celebrate or panic. I waited until later, until I could check quietly, compare timelines without drawing attention. Each verification tightened the picture, turning suspicion into certainty. There was no coincidence left to hide behind. Everything aligned. What surprised me wasn't the scale of it, but how confidently they'd assumed I wouldn't notice. They'd built their plan around the idea that I was no longer paying attention. That assumption had become their weak point. As the days passed, they grew lighter, almost relieved. He joked more. She laughed more openly. Plans were discussed as if they were already victories. They talked about what came next without lowering their voices, without checking the room. I sat there listening, my silence misread as resignation. They were celebrating the end of me without realizing they were writing my case for me. There were moments when it took effort not to intervene, not to correct a statement that contradicted something else they'd said, not to stop a conversation and ask the question that would have unraveled everything. Each time I reminded myself why I couldn't. Speaking too soon would weaken everything. Silence still protected me. They began to assume I wasn't interested in details anymore. That assumption freed them from caution. He mentioned arrangements casually, confident enough to speak in half sentences, trusting that no one was tracking the full story. I was. I wrote nothing down in front of them. I asked no questions that couldn't be explained away as idle curiosity. I waited for repetition, for confirmation, for the moment when the pattern became undeniable. It came sooner than I expected. One evening, a conversation overlapped itself, a detail repeated with a slight variation, just enough to expose the truth beneath it. He corrected himself too quickly, glossing over the inconsistency with a laugh. She didn't notice. Neither did anyone else. I did. From that point on, there was no undoing it. They couldn't take back what they'd already revealed. They couldn't correct what they didn't know had been noticed. The window for adjustment had closed. I felt something settle in my chest then. Not triumph, not anger, certainty. Fear receded, replaced by control. They continued celebrating, unaware of how exposed they were. Conversations grew louder, looser. Assumptions were spoken as if they were facts. They believed the story was finished, the ending secured. I let them believe it. There was a temptation late at night to confront him, to ask how long he thought he could pretend I was invisible, to force him to acknowledge what I now understood completely. The urge passed quickly. Confrontation would have given him time to reinforce, to explain, to reshape. Time was no longer something I was willing to give away. Instead, I waited. Waiting wasn't passive anymore. It was deliberate. Every day they continued as if nothing could touch them, added another layer of exposure. Every assumption they made about my silence tightened the outcome they couldn't see coming. I watched as they laughed together, relaxed and certain, planning a future built on the belief that I was no longer part of the equation. They spoke about me as if I were already gone, already resolved, already dealt with. I stayed quiet. From that moment on, the outcome was no longer a question of if, only when. The legal process began quietly, without confrontation or announcements. I didn't file anything the moment I knew. I didn't rush to make calls or demand meetings. I waited until everything was aligned, until the information I had gathered formed a complete, coherent story that didn't rely on my interpretation or emotion. Facts don't need persuasion when they're allowed to stand on their own. The first step wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. A consultation framed as a precaution, a review rather than an accusation. I chose my words carefully, presented timelines instead of feelings, documents instead of suspicions. I didn't say betrayal. I didn't say affair. I said discrepancy. That distinction mattered. The person across from me listened without interrupting, their pen slowing as the picture took shape. When I finished, they leaned back slightly and asked a single question that told me everything. "Do they know you're here?" I shook my head. They nodded once, decisively. "Good." From that point on, I understood something essential. This wasn't about catching anyone off guard. It was about letting them continue exactly as they were, long enough to remove any doubt about intent. I followed instructions precisely. No sudden changes, no visible resistance, no behavior that might suggest I was preparing anything. If anything, I became more agreeable, more detached. I stopped asking about the future entirely. That made them comfortable. Comfort breeds mistakes. Paperwork moved quietly. Requests were made under neutral pretenses. Information surfaced through routine channels, verified and cross-checked without urgency. Every confirmation strengthened the structure I was building, one that didn't rely on confrontation to hold its shape. They remained unaware. He spoke openly about timelines now, about when things would be finalized, about how clean everything would be. He believed control meant predictability. He believed he was guiding the process. In reality, he was revealing it. I kept my posture relaxed. I didn't press for details. I let him talk himself into certainty. The more confident he became, the less cautious he was with his language. At night, when the house was quiet, I reviewed everything calmly. There was no rush, no panic, no fear that something would collapse if I didn't act immediately. The system worked slowly, but it worked thoroughly. Once set in motion, it didn't need constant interference. That was the difference between reacting and proceeding. There were moments when I felt the weight of what I was doing. Not guilt, but gravity. I understood the consequences clearly. Once this reached its conclusion, nothing would return to the way it had been. There would be no reconciliation, no gentle exit, no mutual understanding. I accepted that. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was seeking accuracy. The truth had already been distorted once. I wasn't going to allow it to be rewritten again. The formal filing came later, after everything had been reviewed and positioned correctly. Even then, it wasn't announced with drama. It was delivered through proper channels, handled with the same restraint I'd maintained throughout. When the notification finally reached him, I wasn't there to see his reaction. That absence was intentional. I heard about it later, through fragmented accounts and secondhand observations. Confusion first, then irritation, then something closer to disbelief. He hadn't expected resistance. He hadn't expected structure. He'd expected emotion, something he could manage. Instead, he was facing something impersonal and precise. His confidence shifted into agitation. Questions were asked, calls were made, explanations were drafted and redrafted, adjusting tone as he tried to understand what had changed. What had changed was simple. I was no longer playing the role he'd assigned me. By the time he tried to speak to me directly, it was already too late for the conversation he wanted to have. I listened politely, responded minimally, and offered nothing that wasn't already required. He searched my face for something familiar, anger, sadness, hesitation. There was nothing there for him. He left unsettled, not because I'd said anything threatening, but because I hadn't given him anything to work with. No argument to win, no emotion to redirect. That was when he realized control had shifted. The weeks leading up to the hearing were tense but quiet. He moved through them like someone trying to regain footing on unstable ground. She stayed close to him, supportive but nervous. The ease they'd once had was gone, replaced by whispered conversations and careful glances. They were still laughing sometimes. Old habits don't disappear overnight, but the laughter had lost its certainty. I remained calm. I didn't gloat. I didn't provoke. I didn't rush the process or demand acceleration. I trusted what I'd built. There was nothing left to add. By the time the courtroom date arrived, the narrative they'd relied on was already compromised. Not publicly, not yet, but structurally. The foundation they believed was solid had been examined carefully and found wanting. They walked into that courtroom believing the ending was still theirs to control. I walked in knowing the story had already been decided. All that remained was for it to be read out loud. The courtroom felt different this time. Not louder or quieter, just tighter, as if the air itself had been pulled taut. People sat straighter. Papers were handled more carefully. Even the murmurs carried a cautious edge. This wasn't the kind of hearing where assumptions went unchallenged. Something about the room made that clear. My husband walked in with the confidence of someone who believed momentum was on his side. He nodded to people he recognized, offered small smiles, settled into his seat like this was a formality he'd already rehearsed. His mistress sat close, composed and attentive, playing her role perfectly. They looked prepared. They weren't prepared enough. I took my seat without looking at either of them. I didn't need to. Their presence no longer affected my focus. Everything that mattered was already in motion, independent of my reactions. The judge entered, and the room rose and fell in practiced unison. When we sat again, silence followed quickly, the kind that doesn't invite interruption. The judge glanced over the file briefly, then looked up, his expression neutral but attentive. Proceedings began routinely. Names, dates, procedural language that felt almost soothing in its predictability. My husband relaxed visibly as the early minutes passed without incident. He leaned back slightly, confident the structure would protect him. That confidence made him careless. When it was his turn to speak, he did so smoothly. He framed the situation as uncomplicated, emphasizing cooperation, efficiency, and resolution. His tone was calm, rehearsed, designed to sound reasonable. He spoke as if nothing was contested, as if the outcome was simply waiting to be confirmed. The judge listened without reacting. Then came the questions. They weren't aggressive. They weren't dramatic. They were precise. Each one followed logically from the last, narrowing the focus until there was very little room left to maneuver. Dates were clarified. Language was examined. Assumptions were gently challenged. My husband answered confidently at first, then more carefully, then with slight hesitation. The judge paused over one detail, reading silently for longer than expected. The room waited. Someone shifted in their seat. The sound felt louder than it should have. "Can you explain this discrepancy?" the judge asked, tapping the page lightly. "Between these two records?" It was a simple question. The answer wasn't simple. My husband spoke, then stopped, adjusting his phrasing mid-sentence. He tried again, offering an explanation that sounded plausible but incomplete. The judge listened, head tilted slightly, then asked a follow-up that exposed the gap immediately. I didn't look at him, but I felt the shift. The ease left his posture. His confidence thinned into something brittle. His mistress glanced at him briefly, concern flashing across her face before she smoothed it away. She clasped her hands tighter in her lap. The judge turned the page. More questions followed, each one small, each one undeniable. No accusations were made, no voices were raised. The weight came from the accumulation, from the pattern emerging in real time, impossible to dismiss as coincidence. My husband's answers grew shorter. His tone changed. He began to qualify statements he'd just made. The story he'd relied on started to bend under its own inconsistencies. This was the moment the room changed. People leaned forward. Pens paused mid-note. The casual certainty that had filled the space earlier evaporated, replaced by attention sharp enough to cut. The laughter from earlier hearings felt distant now, almost embarrassing in hindsight. The judge looked at him steadily. "You've described this as straightforward," he said, not unkindly. "It appears more complex than that." The words landed heavily. My husband opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. For the first time he looked unsettled, not angry, not defensive, uncertain. The judge turned his attention briefly toward me. Not for long. Just enough to acknowledge my presence as something other than background. I met his gaze calmly, offering nothing but composure. That was enough. When proceedings paused briefly, whispers broke out across the room. They weren't mocking this time. They were cautious, curious. People glanced between us, recalibrating the story they'd brought in with them. My husband sat rigidly now, eyes fixed forward, jaw tight. The role he'd prepared for no longer fit the moment unfolding in front of him. He wasn't in control of the narrative anymore. When the judge resumed, his tone remained measured, but the direction was unmistakable. Clarifications were requested, records were referenced, timelines were aligned publicly, piece by piece. The truth didn't arrive with a dramatic reveal. It arrived with inevitability. By the time the judge called for a short recess, the confidence my husband had walked in with was gone. In its place was something brittle and exposed. He stood slowly, avoiding eye contact, murmuring something to the woman beside him. She nodded, but her earlier composure had cracked. Her eyes darted toward the judge's bench, then back to him, uncertainty written plainly across her face. I remained seated until instructed otherwise. As people filtered out, I felt the quiet awareness of being watched, not with ridicule or sympathy, but with reassessment. The story had shifted, and everyone in the room knew it. They just didn't know yet how far. I didn't feel triumph. I felt confirmation. Everything I'd built, every moment of restraint, every decision to wait instead of confront, had led here. The structure was holding. The narrative was no longer his to control. As the judge returned and proceedings resumed, I understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't the end. But it was the moment the outcome became unavoidable. The judge didn't raise his voice when the courtroom reconvened. He didn't need to. The silence carried enough weight on its own. Everyone settled back into their seats with a different posture now, less relaxed, more alert. Whatever confidence my husband had left during the recess didn't return with him. The judge began speaking slowly, deliberately, as if laying stones one by one across a widening gap. He summarized what had already been established, not as opinions but as facts, dates, records, inconsistencies that had not been resolved, language that had been presented one way and functioned another. Each sentence closed another door. My husband tried to interject once, politely at first, then with urgency he couldn't quite hide. The judge acknowledged him with a raised hand and continued. That small gesture ended the interruption before it began. What followed wasn't dramatic. There were no gasps, no audible reactions. The power of the moment came from its restraint. The judge referenced documentation that aligned too cleanly to dismiss. He pointed out how decisions had been made unilaterally while presented as mutual. He noted how certain arrangements predated explanations that were offered later. Intent wasn't accused. It was demonstrated. My husband's attorney shifted beside him, flipping through papers more quickly now, searching for something that might slow the momentum. There was nothing left to slow. The structure my husband had relied on was being examined from angles he hadn't prepared for. The judge turned to him again. "You described this as transparent," he said evenly. "Do you still maintain that characterization?" The pause that followed stretched longer than any answer could have filled. My husband spoke, but the words sounded thinner than before. He adjusted his phrasing, tried to reframe, leaned on technicalities that no longer carried authority. The judge listened, then nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that the response had been heard. It wasn't accepted. The woman beside him sat very still now. Gone was the easy confidence she'd carried earlier. She watched the judge closely, hands clenched together, her expression carefully neutral but strained. This wasn't the outcome she'd expected. I remained quiet, exactly where I'd been all along. At one point, the judge addressed me directly, not to ask for emotion or testimony, but to clarify a timeline. His tone was respectful, precise. I answered clearly, without elaboration, without commentary. I gave him what he asked for, and nothing more. That was enough. The shift in the room was unmistakable then. People weren't watching a conflict anymore. They were watching a resolution take shape. The narrative my husband had relied on was no longer viable. It had been dismantled methodically, without spectacle. When the judge finally leaned back, folding his hands briefly, it felt like the release of pressure rather than its escalation. "I'm prepared to rule," he said. No one moved. The ruling itself was calm, structured, and final. It addressed each point directly, outlining why certain claims were unsupported, why certain actions carried consequences, and why assumptions that had been treated as foregone conclusions were not, in fact, valid. There was no room left for reinterpretation. My husband stared straight ahead as the words landed. He didn't react outwardly, but the tension in his shoulders told the truth. This wasn't a setback. It was an unraveling. When the judge finished, he looked up once more, scanning the room briefly before letting his gaze settle. "This court does not reward manipulation presented as order," he said. "Nor does it overlook patterns simply because they were executed quietly." The words were measured. They were devastating. The hearing concluded without flourish. Instructions were given. Next steps outlined. The process moved forward with the same steady precision it had followed all along. There was no victory speech, no moment designed for satisfaction. I stood when instructed, gathered my things calmly, and waited. My husband didn't look at me, not once. He spoke in low tones to his attorney, his voice tight, controlled, as if volume alone might betray how much ground he'd lost. The woman beside him rose slowly, her earlier certainty replaced by calculation. As people began to leave, I felt eyes on me again, not mocking this time, not pitying, curious, reconsidering. The story they'd walked in with no longer fit what they'd witnessed. I didn't acknowledge the attention. I walked out of the courtroom the same way I'd walked in. Head level, steps steady, no rush. Outside, the air felt lighter than it had in months, not because something had been taken away, but because something heavy had finally been set down. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt finished. This wasn't about revenge, it never had been. It was about refusing to disappear quietly. As I moved forward, away from the courtroom and everything it represented, I understood something clearly for the first time since this began. The outcome hadn't been decided by a single moment or clever maneuver. It had been decided the instant I stopped trying to be understood by people who benefited from misunderstanding me. And once that decision was made, there had never been another possible ending. I didn't look back as I left the courthouse. Not because there was nothing behind me, but because everything that mattered was already settled. The doors closed softly, without drama, without the echo I'd imagined so many times before. Outside, the city moved the way it always had, indifferent to endings that felt monumental only to the people living them. For the first time in a long while, that indifference felt like freedom. The days that followed were quiet in a way that wasn't empty. There were practical things to handle, papers to sign, routines to rebuild. None of it felt overwhelming. Each task was a step forward, not an obligation dragging me back. I wasn't repairing damage anymore. I was constructing something new with clear boundaries. People reached out, some cautiously, some with sudden warmth. A few apologized in half-formed ways, explaining how they hadn't known, how they'd assumed, how things had looked different from the outside. I listened politely. I didn't correct them or ask for more. Understanding arrived too late to change anything, and that was fine. I didn't need validation anymore. My husband didn't contact me again, at least not directly. Messages came through formal channels, stripped of emotion, efficient and distant. Whatever confidence he'd once had was gone, replaced by restraint. He no longer assumed access to me, my time, or my attention. That boundary held. The woman who had laughed beside him in the courtroom faded from my awareness almost completely. She had been part of the story, but never the point. What remained wasn't anger toward her, but clarity about what I'd allowed and what I would never allow again. I moved into a smaller place than the one we'd shared. It wasn't grand or impressive, but it was entirely mine. I arranged it slowly, intentionally, choosing what stayed and what didn't. Each decision felt like reclaiming a voice that had been muted for too long. The quiet there was different. It didn't press in, it opened space. Sometimes, late at night, I thought back to the laughter in that courtroom. Not with bitterness, but with perspective. That moment had felt like humiliation at the time, like a final confirmation of how little I mattered in the narrative they'd created. Now I understood it differently. Laughter is easy when you believe you're untouchable. It fades quickly when that belief is challenged. I didn't win because I was louder or sharper or more aggressive. I won because I was patient. Because I understood that power doesn't come from reacting to what's in front of you, but from choosing when and how to move. That lesson stayed with me. I became more selective with my trust. Not guarded, not cynical, just intentional. I listened more closely to how people spoke about others. I noticed who benefited from my silence and who respected my boundaries. Those distinctions mattered now. The most surprising part wasn't the relief, it was the calm confidence that replaced it. The certainty that I could recognize manipulation when it appeared, that I didn't have to explain myself endlessly to be worthy of respect. I wasn't invisible anymore. What happened in that courtroom wasn't a twist of fate or a lucky break. It was the result of many small choices made quietly, consistently, and without announcement. It was the outcome of refusing to disappear, even when that disappearance would have been easier. If there's one thing I learned through all of this, it's that silence can be a weapon or a shield. The difference lies in who controls it. I stopped using mine to protect others and started using it to protect myself. And that changed everything. If you've ever been underestimated, laughed at, or quietly written out of your own story, know this. The people who rush to dismiss you rarely imagine what you're capable of when you stop explaining yourself. They don't see what's coming because they assume nothing is. Sometimes the most powerful response isn't confrontation. It's preparation. If this story resonated with you, if you've lived through something similar or are navigating your own moment of being underestimated, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experience in the comments, or let me know what part of this journey stayed with you the most. And if you want to hear more stories about quiet strength, hidden power, and moments when the tables turn without warning, stay with me. Subscribe, keep listening, and remember, you don't have to be loud to be unstoppable.